In this video, we'll be moving on to line charts and scatter charts. Here in Power BI, we have been building out a report, which can consist of various visuals that are presented across potentially multiple pages. We're currently working with page 1, but we can rename this by double-clicking. Maybe I'll call this matrix/bar. I'll create a new page by clicking this plus sign, and maybe I'll name this one line chart. From the reading, you know that line charts are the best way to present trends over time. So let's create a line chart. In our visualizations pane, it's in the first column, second option. The x-axis will always be some sort of time or date field. So let's bring in sale date for the x-axis. And let's summarize sale amount as our y-axis. So here we've got this very lovely dot, and this lets us know that there's only 1 year of data in this file. In 2024, total sales were about $35 million. But we probably want to look at this data from a more granular level. So I've got the two options again, the double down arrows, this one that's kind of branched out. Do you remember which one I prefer and why? Typically, I'm going to use this one, expanding all down one level in the hierarchy. And the reason why I typically want this one is it's going to preserve the prior levels of the hierarchy as we drill down. There it is by quarters, now by months. If this data spanned multiple years, it would still keep the year that these quarters and months indicate. If I had used the double down arrows, it would have instead provided summary measures for each month, but across all the years in the data at once. And who knows, maybe that's what you want to see. Maybe you want to assess what your seasonality looks like for all the years combined into one graph. But if we want to preserve the actual discrete dates, we're going to stick with this other button. Going down one more level brings us to the daily level. Again, that's probably too granular, so I'll go back up a step. Now going back to our visualization pane, you can see we have secondary y-axis as an option. I would hesitate to ever include one of these. And just to show you why, I'll drag and drop sale amount again here, but I'll change it with this drop down to be the average sale amount. The legend now shows that the light blue line is the summed up field, sum of sale amount. And the relevant y-axis is over here, measured in millions of dollars. But the dark blue color is the average sale amount. And its corresponding axis is on the right-hand side, measured in terms of tens of thousands of dollars. Presenting two y-axes at once can be confusing for readers. We want them to understand our visuals as quickly and effectively as possible. So like I say, I would be hesitant to ever include a secondary y-axis. I'll remove it by clicking the X in the field name next to average. One thing we can also do with a line chart is facilitate comparison across groups, but over time. We will use this legend box to specify the different groups. For example, we could look at sales for different counties over time. Or perhaps instead, I'll remove this one, we could look at different makes. And like before, we can impose filters to restrict our presentation to just a subset of the data. For example, I'll go up to sale date by quarter. Let's look at just the first 2 quarters of the year, and then going to make, let's see how Chevrolet vehicle sales compared to Ford. Using filters can be an effective way to simplify your visuals and emphasize a takeaway. Here we can see that Chevy seems to have an on average increasing trend, where Ford at this point in the year was going down. Let's add a new page again, and this one we'll call scatter chart. We typically think of scatter charts when we want to evaluate relationships between two variables. In other scenarios, you could also use a scatter chart just to get a bird's eye view of a unit of interest across 2 dimensions. I'll be honest, this particular data set doesn't have a lot of opportunities to explore linear relations, but I found one that might be somewhat interesting. One of the case requirements focused on analyzing which locations relied on discounting behavior the most to drive up sales. Each salesperson has a little bit of discretion to seek their manager's approval to sell a vehicle for some amount above or below the MSRP. And one of the quantitative takeaways from the case question was that the dealership location in Cache County seem to issue the largest discounts on vehicles. We can explore the situation visually by creating a scatter chart. This button is in the third row, fourth column. We then have to specify two variables for our X and Y axis. It doesn't really matter which is which, but I'll use MSRP from the products table as my X axis and sale amount from the sales table as my Y axis. Lastly, we need to include a field in our values box to actually get different dots in this scatter chart. Right now we just have a single dot showing us what the sum of these two fields looks like. So in the values box, I need to specify a unit of observation. I want to see what this looks like for every single sales transaction during the year. Well, if I want to uniquely identify each sale, I should use the primary key of the sales table, sale ID. Drag and drop that to values, and now we have hundreds and hundreds of different dots, each representing a unique sale. And at this point, it doesn't matter if I'm summing my X and Y axis or taking the average, because it's going to be performing this aggregation by sale ID, and there will only ever be one MSRP and sale amount per sale. Let me make it a little bit bigger. To further analyze this chart we've created, I'm going to go up to the visualizations pane, and everything we've done so far has been in this build visual tab. The next one over has this cute little paintbrush, and this tab is where we can format our visuals. There are lots of things we can do here to enhance the quality of our visuals, editing titles and other chart elements. We'll focus more on these in the next module. But in the last tab, there's this magnifying glass with hover text saying, add further analyses to your visual. Let's click that. And the very first option says trend line. Let's toggle this on. And by gum, this is the linear regression line that you guys have been quite familiar with in the last unit. This line has minimized the sum of squared residuals. But I don't really need a linear regression line to tell me that these two variables are associated. My eyes are enough to conclude that these fields have an extremely strongly positive correlation. And intuitively, we should probably already know this too, right? Sale amounts are probably never going to depart too far from the MSRP, so this really isn't our focus. I'll turn that off. I'm actually going to click the second to last line, symmetry shading. Let's turn that on. And this is essentially going to draw a line that starts from the origin of this graph and has a slope of 1. In other words, it draws a diagonal line of symmetry across the two variables. This might be hard to see given the current scaling of my X and Y axis, so I'm actually going to go back to Format Visual. I'll add a zoom slider, and let's restrict our attention to sales between $60,000 and $20,000. In other words, we have now drawn a diagonal line of symmetry across these two variables. And this lets me see that for dots above the line in this darker shaded area, these correspond to sales where sale amount was actually higher than the MSRP. And dots below the line reflect discounts that were given. And as you can see, discounting seems to be a more common phenomenon here. If I want to look at this by county, I could drag the county field to my filters. We'll do it for the entire page. And let's see what Cache County looks like in particular. Here we can see that this discounting behavior does seem to be pretty evident at this location. And that wraps up the major categories of visuals we'll be working with in this course. You're now prepared to work on an exercise that will be your participation assignment for this week.